Welcome to this episode of The Collector's Corner, brought to you by the Washington Arms Collectors. This is titled The Featherweight and a Heart of Gold, or The Problems of Thor Bridge. The Egyptians believed that at the last day, your heart would be weighed in the balance against a feather. If it was too heavy, you'd be gobbled up by crocodile gods or some such thing. Our text is not an ancient book of the dead, but rather a short story published in the Strand magazine in 1922. It later became part of a compilation called The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, published in 1927. The story is The Problem of Thor Bridge. Spoiler alert. The central plot device is a suicide disguised as a homicide to send a romantic rival to the gallows. Our cast of characters includes the fiery Brazilian beauty, Maria Gibson, née Pinto, the wife of an American billionaire and the mother of his two children, Miss Grace Dunbar, the governess of the two children and the perceived romantic rival. Over them all is the glittering firmament created by the most powerful man in the world, Mr. Neil Gibson, a.k.a. the Gold King. Cue up the 1964 anthem to Goldfinger. Miss Dunbar denies she is romantically involved with her employer, but she does say she steers him in a more altruistic fashion, encouraging him to use his power and wealth not to crush individuals or nations, but to do good. Mrs. Gibson, more cynical, proposes a 5-step program to send her rival to the gallows. Step number 1. Mrs. Gibson goes to her husband's over-brimming gun room and selects a case double set of revolvers. She loads them both, discharges one chamber of one of the revolvers. The other revolver she decorates in a peculiar manner. She attaches a piece of twine to its grip like a kite tail. Step number 2, she sends an invitation to Miss Dunbar to meet her at Thor Bridge. Thor Bridge is across a stream about a half-mile from the country manor in Hampshire where the Gibsons live. The invitation is RSVP. Step number 3, with the RSVP signed by Miss Dunbar in hand, Mrs. Gibson plants the discharged revolver in the wardrobe of Miss Dunbar. You might call this the lying witch and the wardrobe. Step number 4, she meets Miss Dunbar at the appointed hour and engages in a fiery denunciation doubtless laced with Spanish profanity. Step number 5, when Miss Dunbar flees in a horror at this outburst, Mrs. Gibson then completes the decoration of the revolver by tying to the free end of the twine a sizable stone which she finds by the bridge. She then dangles the stone off of the bridge parapet, steps across to the other side of the bridge with the signed RSVP in her left hand and the revolver in her right hand. She fires a bullet through her brain. The falling stone pulls the revolver from her hand. Voila! We have a corpse, an apparent homicide, and a trail of clues that leads inevitably to Miss Dunbar. However, enter Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson at the behest of the Gold King. Holmes deduces what Mrs. Gibson has done, in part because of a 6-pence-sized mark on the bridge parapet. He knows this is where the revolver struck and chipped the stone. He proposes a forensic revolver reenactment using Watson's revolver. How can any reenactment done by living reenactors capture what happens after a bullet goes through the human brain? Let me illustrate.
Bridge. Gun. Oh. For it. Oh, where are the cadaveric spasms?
As the gentleman said, what becomes of the cadaveric spasms and claspings? Just as her left hand held the RSVP with the signature of Miss Dunbar, would not her hand clasp the revolver all the more tightly? Could it actually be pulled loose from a cadaver's hand? Here, a skilled Queen's Counsel would have torn this defense into shreds. Happily, Miss Dunbar's defense rests not on the result of passing a bullet through the human brain, but it rests on the capacious lumber room of the brain of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, and therein was stored the fact that 4 years earlier there was an identical case. The professor of criminology at the University of Graz, Hans Gross, records that there was a case of insurance fraud perpetuated by a grain merchant. The grain merchant disguised his suicide on a bridge as a robbery homicide, and his mechanism of this fraud was point for point identical to what Mrs. Gibson did, including the mark on the bridge parapet. The nature of Watson's revolver used in the forensic reenactment. We are not told it is a service revolver. It is said to be short, handy, but serviceable and weighty. Moreover, it's said to have a safety catch, and it is able to be carried in the hip pocket. Some have said the only revolver which would qualify would be the Webley Mark III pocket revolver, and I have here an example of that revolver. This one is done in nickel. Note it has a charming little lanyard ring, perfect for your bow tying of a little bit of twine. But it lacks one thing. Well, it lacks two things. This particular model does not have the side safety catch. It also doesn't have sufficient weight. It is a featherweight. Could this revolver have made a mark on a bridge parapet? In fairness to those who suggest this revolver, you could get it with a slightly larger grip. Here's the slightly larger grip, and also an illustration of the side safety. However, we have an old friend who fits the bill. I've said that there was an arcane connection between the Silver Fletcher's patent, the expert revolver, and Mr. Holmes. I would propose this as a connection. The Silver and Fletcher revolver was notable for having auto-ejection, which I've demonstrated on camera, but had one other property. It had a safety catch. Let me illustrate. You could turn this switch, bingo, it is on safety, and you pull the trigger, and the hammer does not strike. The story ends with the possibility that Miss Dunbar and Mr. Gibson will continue their partnership, and perhaps, at the last, the Gold King will be shown to have a heart of gold. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Collector's Corner. Please stay tuned for further episodes, and until then, keep your powder dry, your money ready, and both eyeballs skun for those amazing bargains and fantastical historical items you might find in the tables of the Washington Arms Collectors or our beloved organization, the Oregon Arms Collectors. Thank you. Okay, now we have the problem of removing the revolver from Thor stream here. Oh, there we go. Oh, goodness. Aha! We have it! And we actually have a mark on the bridge, too.